All right, I think we can get started. Thank you all for joining us for today's Lunchtime Art Talk, which, as many of you know, is a weekly series led by Hammer curators on works from our collection. This series will focus on artists featured in Made in LA 2020, a version. Free reservations to visit our biennial at the Hammer Museum are available now online. Visit our website to reserve your ticket and reserve your slot. My name is Nicholas Barlow. I'm a curatorial assistant at the Hammer, and I'll be facilitating this afternoon's talk on Umar Rashid. After the presentation, I will be able to answer any questions you may have. A few Zoom notes before we begin. When the presentation starts, please select Speaker View in the top right corner of your screen. In the top middle of your screen, please select View Option to ensure side by side and Fit to Window. Those are all quotes in my script. Make sure all of those are checked. Please note that today's program is being recorded. You have the option to toggle your camera on and off at the camera icon at the bottom. If you do not want to be featured in the recording, you just turn your camera off. You will remain on mute until the end of the presentation, at which point I will unmute those who have questions. During the presentation, if you have any questions for me, including any technical issues, you can ask those in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen. Someone from our team will help and answer those if they're not related to the program. So with that, I think we can start talking about Umar's work. So let's pull up the slide. Keen, thank you. Umar Rashid is a Chicago-born, Los Angeles-based artist whose practice moves across painting, drawing, sculpture, garment, and music. At the core of his practice and at the core of his work is an ever-expanding cosmology of alternative histories and revisionist historical narratives, reconfigurations of official, in quotes, official historical record shifted to acknowledge, champion, and plug in figures marginalized, oppressed, and often erased from those histories. Rashid's work is informed by a wide array of hyper-reference. Cultural figures and historical symbols plucked from a panoply of cultures and time periods, which when merged together collapse geography and temporality. Though his figures can sometimes be rendered in simple sketch-like forms, Rashid steers clear of simplistic dichotomies, challenging the viewer with complex iconographic language of arcane classifying systems and cosmological diagrams. Umar is a self-described storyteller who takes historical fact as a base and imprints upon it reconstructed history, often surreal, often absurd, but with a serious focus on the looming ghosts of colonialism and its long violence and long effects. His painterly tales complicate the idea of what is true and false, prompting us to consider whether the truths that we are taught may in fact be lies, fabricated myths to continue and maintain systems of power and oppression. Today, I'll be focusing specifically on Rashid's triptych currently on display at the Hammer, which has an incredible title, which I'll read right now. The Battle of Malibu, parentheses, in 3 parts, 1795, Part 1, Sea Battle, Little Red Corvette. Part 2, The Death of Father Wiyat. If we can do this to a god, imagine what we'll do to you. Part 3, Surf Riders versus the Jaguars from Mars, 2020. Next slide. I will use this work to discuss Rashid's practice and idiosyncratic visual lexicon, which the artist has been honing and expanding for decades. I will also attempt to decode some of the symbols and visual motifs peppered throughout this work. Here it is in display at the Hammer Museum, which I would like to emphasize now that we are open, especially for works like Rashid's, for Umar's. I would recommend you come and see it in person. Not only is that you can capture the scale, but the hyper detail, which you'll see as we continue on, it really, really benefits from a kind of close reading. Next slide. Umar Rashid was born in Chicago and raised on the city's south side. His father was an artist and playwright. His mother was an actress and illustrator. As a kid, Umar would mainly stay inside, reading history books and encyclopedias given to him by his grandmother, a valuable spark, igniting his intense interest in history and mythology. He studied at Chicago's Institute of Positive Education, now called the Betty Shabazz Academy. It was here he received an education that emphasized and championed Black history and versed its students in the work of Black artists and historians. Umar moved to Los Angeles around 2000. For many years, he worked under a series of pseudonyms and monikers. Musically, he has performed as Kent Cyclone, an improvisational music and song generator, as one half of Super Deluxe, a throwback 80s rap group with Mika James, and as the Grim Teachers, a faux golden age hip hop group. It was only in 2014 that he did his first solo exhibition under his birth name, Umar Rashid. Next slide. Rashid's most notable and longest operating moniker was Faux Hawk Two Feathers, a name he donned to embody the role of scribe and documenter of a fictitious battle, the fictitious battles and exploits of the Franglish Empire, an imaginary Union powerhouse combine of the French and English, lasting from 1658 through 1880. For 17 years, Umar documented this complex historical saga, which played out over large and small canvases and across drawings, portraits, maps, costumes, and faux battle flags. In these works, Umar depicts battles of the Franglish agents, Franglish soldiers against native populations of the lands they're trying to colonize, and against competing imaginary empires, such as the North American Belhaven Republic and the Dutch Batvian Empire. Rashid has an extensive and prolific writing practice, which accompanies his painted works and objects. He writes out the stories that give background to his visual works. Extensively researched, these histories become a guide to Umar and a key to the viewer, a way for us to access them. In many ways, he's taking this kind of hybrid of history and he's starting to collapse them into stories and hone them and trying to make a kind of a multiverse of a narrative, a larger narrative or cosmos in which he engages. Next slide. The Battle of Malibu, which I mentioned is at the Hammer Museum, has a corresponding work at the Huntington, which I'm not really going to talk about right now, which is equally intricate and amusing and has and intense and funny and dark and morose and macabre. And it also has an incredible title, which is Stockholm Caliphas, 1795, Goodbye Sancho, my tormentor, I Still Love You, On the Colonized Mind, or A Possible Escape into Apathy, or Unbridled Joy Upon Death of Your Oppressor, followed by Raucous Laughter. And this, I mean, this is really kind of apt for a lot of Umar's practice, which is that it has this incredible, long, intricate kind of 18th century title. And also it has these kind of turn of phrases happening and this playfulness. So Stockholm, California, or Califas is a kind of also a reference to Stockton, California, you could say, but also this idea of Stockholm syndrome, and especially looking at the idea of enslaved people who basically had Stockholm syndrome with their kind of with the enslavers that they next slide. And now to the Battle of Malibu. The Battle of Malibu is the culmination of over 5 years, 5-ish years of work and research on the colonization and violence enacted upon the native population of Southern California, specifically the Tongva and Chumash people by the Spanish Empire. It has a focus on the oppressive and violent mission system which enslaved native populations. To Umar, the imagining the site of Malibu as a kind of site for war was an amusing and kind of a fascinating exercise for him too. He started to think about Malibu and the rocky cliffs and how hard it would be to kind of enact a battle or to take a mountain, but also thought about the kind of current day Malibu and this idea of this hub of wealth and these amazing homes, and imagining that as a site for a battle or a kind of historic battle that never happened, which is to say that the Battle of Malibu, this term, actually is not a reference to a real battle, but a fabricated one. This kind of idea of Malibu and destruction reminds me of a chapter of a book, a chapter from the historian Mike Davis's book, Ecologies of Fear, in which he has a chapter titled "The Case for Letting Malibu Burn." It's the same kind of imagining happening, though in a different way. Next slide. Umar came to this story, to the idea of the Battle of Malibu, actually, and it's been a long time coming, as I mentioned, over 5 years of research. But it actually started in some ways with his work, his earlier work in dealing with Franglish and thinking about the kind of colonization and battles of Eastern United States, but also kind of a separate series or a kind of continuation of that series that he was doing on the kind of Caribbean. And so both works from the kind of Eastern United States and the Caribbean started to slowly move east and move inland, and from the Caribbean move up the Yucatan. And in his drawings and writings, everything started to move west. And so this is also the culmination of many years of slowly crossing across the United States to end up at the shore. Next slide. I'm going to try to go through some of the images in here, and I have a lot of slides, so I'm going to try to do it really quickly. But I just once again want to emphasize that what you should do if you can, and when you feel comfortable to do so, is come to the Hammer or go to the Huntington to see these works in person. They really, it really benefits from a very close reading because it has this kind of hyper detail. Umar in the kind of Battle of Malibu depicts native cultures and native peoples at war with colonizers and at war with the Spanish, but in a kind of way that embraces a variety of kind of visual styles, and especially kind of drawn styles. So he's taking from not only a kind of historical renderings of battles done by Native Americans, and specifically, let's say, the kind of Plains tribe ledger art of people like Red Horse, documenting battles, but is also borrowing from comic books, also borrowing from a kind of Chicano car culture and kind of drawn culture, to try to render all of this cacophonous battle that is happening. Next slide. Umar works in code. Many times there are codes and kind of puns spread throughout the canvas. So here we have a figure which is written on the card. It says Black Jesus, driving in a Corvette, and we have the Corvette both as a stand-in for the car, but also for the French Navy warship, the Corvette. And also, as in talking to Umar, he says it's also a reference to the 1978 Mark Hamill comedy, Corvette Summer, which I think no one has seen except Umar. I had no idea about it. But this code and this kind of piling on of code and applying many, many different codes and many, many different symbols is not necessarily to be read or easily understood. You're supposed to kind of live with it, move through it, take what you can from it. But really what's happening is Umar is creating this massive network of images to kind of get at these grander stories of kind of conflict, battle, colonization, violence, and long history. Next slide. As I mentioned, it is a documentation and a representation also of a kind of a reference to the native population of Southern California, specifically the Tongva and the Chumash. And he actually pointed out to me that Malibu, the term Malibu, the original name for Malibu, would have been Himalu, which is the Chumash version of talking about Malibu. So once again, trying to plug in this narrative into a kind of grander history of battle, but kind of focusing on and giving empathy and focus towards the kind of native and oppressed in this moment population within that. Next slide. Umar is a self-taught artist, and he was trained in many ways by kind of just a constant absorbing, not only of kind of history, as I had mentioned, but also just of visual studies and just every kind of visuality, every kind of visual art form, from comic books to fine art to kind of Persian miniatures. And so it not only is the work a kind of collapsing of history, but Umar himself is a representation of many, many different styles, all kind of sandwiched together. And I think it's very interesting to think about his work also in relationship to other kind of self-taught artists, such as figures like Bill Traylor and Howard Finster, and this idea of people who would be making these expansive worlds that are all kind of interconnected through illustration and through these kind of building up. Next slide. And there are these little moments that capture that, once again, when you get close to it, that you have, you can take time with. And again, I think that's something to another advertisement to come and see the works in person if you can. One of the major reference points also for Umar is, next slide, the 15th century painter from the Netherlands, Hieronymus Bosch. And so Bosch, and especially a work such as this, The Garden of Earthly Delights, creates this massive cacophony of incredibly dense chaos of biblical narrative, historical narrative, and all kind of piled up onto each other in this hyper surreal, humorous, horrifying, absurd panorama. And that is something that is very much felt and seen within Umar's work, is this panorama of both simultaneously kind of awe, humor, horror, and surreal depictions of time and of the past and of kind of spirituality and mythology all at once. Next slide. And I'll talk a little bit about this one. We have some, I'll decode some of them. We have this kind of spiritual, like kind of ghost of a rattlesnake that moves across. In the center, we have the figure of the wizard from the movie, the 1978 movie, The Wiz. All of these in some ways speaking towards this idea of kind of a collapse of visual styles and a collapse of renderings of kind of spirituality, but also renderings of history and kind of documentation, but also this kind of collapsed temporality. Next slide. I'm going to move through a little bit faster because I realize I'm taking some time. But I wanted to bring up this idea that one of the biggest kind of main points in the work, and one of the main kind of through lines through, is this idea of the mission system. So what we have is we have these figures, usually the natives, at war with a kind of different kind of factors of the Spanish army, and also depicting the kind of friars of the mission system in a series of kind of matrix-like flips and kicks and a kind of superpower throwing God energy at the native people and them defending it. When I talked to Umar, we talked a little bit about this idea of the mission system, but also the kind of mission project. So for a long time in California, there was a series, a assignment that was given to fourth graders in which they would kind of do research on different missions across California, and they would make these renderings, and they would make these kind of with kind of toothpicks kind of built out versions of the missions. This program has stopped because it seemed to kind of really whitewash and really kind of avoid the actual dark history of the mission system, which was very much about kind of, which included enslavement and true violence towards the native population of Southern California. But I like within Umar's work and within this series, you have this kind of accepting of the mission system and that how a child would render it. So this childish rendering of the missions, but it's imbued with the violence of their actual histories simultaneously. Next slide. Umar works a lot in turn of phrases. We have Junipero Cerro, we have Serra. This is both a figure, a reference to the Spanish friar, but also to Richard Serra, the painter. We also have an El Camino, and that El Camino being both the car and also the royal road, the 600-mile road connecting the 21 Spanish missions throughout California. Next slide. We also have Jamaica Man, in referencing a kind of Kool-Aid man, but also referencing the beverages made from kind of a dried floral of Jamaica and hibiscus flowers breaking through this wall of gold bricks. Next slide. And we also have these kind of mythic figures and cartoon and figures pulled from different sources and applied to this kind of historic battle. Next slide. We have Silver Surfer from Marvel. In this case, Umar speaks of him as actually a beacon of good or a beacon of power. And we also have this bear with lasers shooting out of his eyes, taken from the arcade game or the kind of arcade box that of Space Invaders, which he has taken and now implanted onto this battle. Next slide. Next slide. And I want to end by talking about this one section, which is an F anon, a reference to Franz Fanon, but also a reference to Q anon in some ways, or F anon being the only anon that Umar actually cares about, as he said it to me. And I think in looking at Umar's work, I started to think about or kind of go back to reading some of Fanon, who was a kind of who was a philosopher and writer on colonization, decolonization, and the kind of long violences and ghosts of colonization across the globe. And I came across this phrase, which shows up in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, in his section on concerning violence, in which he says, decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. And this disorder, which is very much present within Umar's work, is also something that I think is very important part of the work. It is a disorder of history. It is a fragmentation. It is many stories happening all at once. It is a collision of many different narratives, and it is a repetition of different narratives over time. And in many ways, by looking at Umar's work and by studying these repetitions and reading between the pieces, we begin to understand this repetition and we begin to understand these long effects, these long violences. In some ways, it is an attempt to rewrite, but also it is a way to understand. So with that, we'll now be getting to answer some of your questions. I think we can open it up for questions if anyone has any. I'm going to check the chat right now to see. Bear with me for a second. Oh, I have a question really fast from someone, which is, can you speak about Umar's alternative name, Frohawk Two Feathers? Do you know where it comes from and what it means? Yes, so it comes from, there's a story, which is that it comes from a couple different places, but really I think the important thing to remember or to kind of focus on it was this idea of creating an anonymous artist. So he wanted to create a moniker that would kind of put himself back, and he would kind of disconnect from the work and kind of create this mystery around it. And as I mentioned, it's really kind of a continuation. Even now, he'll sometimes present himself as Umar Rashid, parentheses, Frohawk Two Feathers, to kind of distance himself or to kind of place that as to acknowledge the moniker, but also that he's kind of moved beyond it. Do we have any more questions? Oh, I have a question from Lisa. Lisa, I'm gonna ask you to unmute. So Lisa, you should be able to, there we go.
Okay. Yes, a couple of technical questions. It said that when you were showing the piece, it said that it was oil and mixed media on what? What is the surface that he's painting on?
For this one, I believe it's canvas. Let me see if I have it written. It should be Canvas. I believe a Canvas, but that does bring up a good point, which is those kind of question to materials is really important, especially to Umar, who's often kind of also used kind of canvas that he's dipped in kind of tea and coffee to create this kind of older effect, but also to reference these kind of materials that were kind of used and distributed and sent around using exploited labor and kind of enslaved people also. So there's this kind of idea, this obsession with material also tying into everything else. Any other questions? Lisa, you have one more question.
Yeah, you mentioned that that he creates kind of a whole literature around his work. When you see the exhibit, is there a long description, or how is it incorporated in some way?
So there's a short description with the exhibition, but for this part of this part of his series, which is still ongoing, the kind of California series, it is piece he's still kind of writing out. So there will actually be a kind of epilogue coming sometime soon that will have a continuation of this narrative, and the written material may live with that, but sometimes the material exists and is available, and sometimes it just is for Umar.
Thank you.
Okay, well, with that, that's perfect timing. It's 1 o'clock. Thank you so much for taking the time. And again, I really would recommend coming by the Hammer Museum if you can. I want to say 2 quick things before we leave, which I've written down. Give me a second. Which is that Umar will be leading an online art making workshop geared towards university students, but open to anyone on Monday, May 17th at 7 p.m. In the workshop, participants will learn about his work and then create a drawing or map project that envisions a utopian outcome of the historic event. The program is called A Malleable History, an art making workshop with Umar Rashid, and it's happening on Monday, May 17th. And I'm going to attach in the chat, there's a link to this program, which I would highly recommend. Also, Umar has an exhibition, aside from the Hammer, up at Transformative Arts LA in downtown LA, which we would recommend checking out. Thank you so much for joining this afternoon's lunchtime art talk. Special thanks to Bank of America for presenting Made in LA 2020, a version. To support programs like this and future programs, we invite you to become a Hammer member or donate to the museum by visiting us at hammer.ucla.edu/support. Be sure to join us next week, so Lunchtime Art Talks, where Made in LA 2020 Assistant Curator of Performance, Ikechuyu Onyewenyi, will present on Sun, Justin Leroy, which should be really great. So thank you guys all, and see you guys next week.